Hey everybody, Garry Adelman, American Battlefield Trust. Here we are at yet another battlefield as we swing to cover the Appomattox campaign and what's going to go on at Appomattox. And I think as you're starting to learn, there's a whole lot going on in between the fall of Richmond and Petersburg and then what's going to go on at Appomattox. And we're kind of near the middle here. We are at Sayler's Creek. We're looking due south across the creek, which is in the bottomland behind me. And there is going to be, you could say one of the last grand battles of the Civil War. This is a real deal fight. It's going to take place in 3 different areas, okay? And some of that area, the best known area, is right here near the Hillsman House, which is right behind the camera. We'll show you that before long. But to talk about this battle and this battlefield, let's bring on Josh Lindamood. He is a ranger here at the Sayler's Creek Battlefield State Historic Park. Welcome.
Welcome. Yeah, thank you. Glad to have the American Battlefield Trust here, and excited to be able to show off the battlefield today.
Good. So, we have shot video already at Five Forks and at the Breakthrough, and now we're starting to move more along Lee's Retreat. The Confederates can't be in great shape. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but let's bring sort of the Union forces here. How did they get here, and who's going to be in this vicinity?
Right, so one of the first opening engagements on the 6th takes place about a half mile from here to the rear of the camera, and as that attack takes place, the men are forced down in this direction. The commands of Richard Anderson and Richard Ewell are sent down this road because of the Federal cavalry attack. Used the Hillsman House as a hospital at first, and then the 6th Corps, Army of the Potomac, come down under direction of Horatio Wright. And when they deploy, they set up just to the rear of the Hillsman House along with all the outbuildings. So there would have been a summer kitchen and a smokehouse and probably a barn or 2 here as well. And what wasn't being used as a hospital soon was at that point. The Federals pushed the Confederates down the hill and then deployed 20 pieces of artillery. You see one of the pieces over here behind us, a recreation of course, but 20 pieces under the command of Major Andrew Cowan. And for about 30 minutes, they opened up and started to shell the Confederates on the opposite ridge across Sayler's Creek.
And the Confederates had lots of artillery with them to respond, right?
No, they did not. No evidence of counter-battery fire whatsoever.
The Confederates are really disparate at this point. And then, of course, what's going to happen, and we're going to cover most of the fighting from the other side of the creek, but what's going to happen is, of course, you've got 2 divisions. I mean, this is Wright's 6th Corps. These are experienced men. We have got Truman Seymour's division. We've got Frank Wheaton's division. They've seen a whole lot of fighting. Is there anything about, without getting into really the fight itself, but anything about descending here? Is this a dangerous place to be while they came? Were there advanced Confederates shooting at them?
So there were. A delay in action was set up on this side of the creek, but you mentioned there's 2 divisions of Federals that deploy here. They use the road as a guide. On the left side of the road that the house is on, the 1st Division deploys, and then the 3rd sets up on the right side of the road. So the 2nd is held in reserve. And these men, although they traverse and this open space and do have the numbers, they don't have the high ground. So it is a very dangerous space to go down and across. And then once you cross the creek and the swamp, redress your ranks and prepare for the assault.
All right, so I'm going to use that as a little transition, but before we do that, just for anybody watching who's a little confused, because you can never be reminded too much about organizations, divisions make up corps, okay? Mm-hmm. Below divisions, brigades make up divisions, regiments make up brigades, and companies make up regiments, of course. So think about that. So you talked about dressing along the way. Let's move on to dressing. I said I would do a transition here as we walk over a little bit this way, over toward the Hillsman House, because you said that this was a hospital that the Confederates were using it before the battle. That's
yes.
Pretty different, by the way. Usually that's a little bit different. And then it's going to be a more substantial hospital after the battle, right?
Yes, sir.
Tell us about the operations in here as we go in.
Well, this, of course, was not originally built as a hospital, but turned into a hospital because of the fighting. The first casualties come down from what we now call Holt's Corner, and the Confederates are set up shop here and start treating their wounded. Those that can leave with the Army, and the Federal medical departments take over and turn this into their field hospital.
Okay, and obviously we want to talk about the hospital, but real quick, this is somebody's home too, right?
It is. This is the home of Captain James Moses Hillsman. He is serving in the 44th Virginia Infantry. He enlists as a sergeant and is captured at Spotsylvania Courthouse, so he's in federal prison when this fight takes place, but his wife is here in the home, and there are 2 small children and 4 female slaves and 1 male slave.
Wow. So I see as I'm looking around, and by the way, you've done such a nice job in here because you're portraying hospital operations sort of both armies. Could you tell us a little bit about what you know about the hospital here?
So we know that the floors are original, which is probably the most incredible feature in the house that has not been touched. It's a house that was built in the 1770s and 80s, so it's old. There are stains all across the floor. However, we have confirmed through forensics testing with the Liberty University and the Virginia State Police, they have proved that there's human DNA in some of the blood stains that have been confirmed here at the hospital.
And I see the way you've set this up, sort of. It looks pretty haphazard. Why would it have such a look? I really love what you've done here.
So we try to give the appearance that this might have been the scene as it looked on April the 6th, potentially even into April the 7th. I tell visitors when we cross the threshold, entering the back door of the home, when you go in, you're going to see a chaotic scene. Imagine it being a working hospital and a room for recovery. When you come into the home, everybody that was in here disappears, vanishes. So everything that's left behind is what you see.
Wow. And this isn't the focus of this video. We have other videos on medical aspects of the Civil War. What I want to say to anybody watching is disabuse yourself, please, of the idea of how much smarter you are of the people in the past, and that you know about germ theory and they don't, and they had invisible things living on them that they didn't know about yet that we can now know about and whatnot. So they were using the best techniques they had. And by this point in the war, it had really evolved. Hospital operations, preserving life by triage and by having aid stations in field hospitals like this.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I like the way that we can still see that this is somebody's house. I see bottles over there. I'm seeing a lot of soldier gear. I'm seeing some of the normal aspects of life with the apple and a cup over here. And you could just see, imagine, people living in here. I understand this house was within the same family until it was turned over for preservation.
It was. And in the 1930s, when the state started acquiring land, it started right here at the Hillsman House and then turned into what we now know as Sailor's Creek Battlefield.
Okay, good. And I think I'm going to call an audible. I see Kris looking at some of the exposed brick, but let's end this section of the video. Kris can look out this camera over to where we're going to pick up this video, actually across the ridge here. You're going to be looking across Sailor's Creek over to what the park calls an overlook over there, and we will shortly snap our fingers and reappear on the other side of Sailor's Creek. Okay, now we've moved across Sailor's Creek. We're on the other side, almost looking at an opposite view of what we saw before. That's the Hillsman House over my shoulder there. And where we left off, of course, the Union 6th Corps elements thereof, we're going to be advancing across Sailor's Creek. But we're on the Confederate side now, so let's bring Josh back on. Who are these Confederates?
The Confederates on this ridge are under the command of Lieutenant General Richard Ewell, and he has a hodgepodge of troops. Veteran commands under Joseph Kershaw, and also General Custis Lee's first field command of folks that were sent out of Richmond.
What an unfortunate place and circumstance to have your first battle.
Right.
My God. So, you said it was hodgepodge. Let's get into that a teeny bit here, because the whole Army is sort of hodgepodge at this point. You've got corps you've never heard of and everything. So what's their condition and how are they operating in this terrible moment, a very difficult moment?
So part of the hodgepodge, we have heavy artillery, men that have been turned into infantry, the heavies. There are also CS Navy and CS Marines here, along with some accounts of civilians that are firing with flintlocks, of all things here. But these men are absolutely exhausted, especially on April the 6th, where the battle kind of culminates here on the banks of Big and Little in Sailor's Creek. At some counts, these men have marched already for 18 miles before this fight even breaks out. So these men are tired, they're hungry, they're wet, and both armies are ready to fight.
And at the same time, just to cover this again, you've got the Confederate Army sort of, some are up here, some are at the crossroads, some are, over near Marshall's.
Right.
I mean, this is a disparate army in a battle I'm sure they didn't want to fight.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're right, they are spread out. The fighting on April 6th goes through 4 separate counties. The Confederate retreating column is close to 20 miles long in some cases. They're just everywhere, and the fighting here just kind of comes to a head.
Good, good. I'm going to hide behind the camera here. Not hide, I'm sorry. I'm going to go behind the camera. I'm going to switch off with Kris White.
So Josh, we're out here. We have Richard Ewell, First Field Command since the Overland Campaign. For most people who don't know, Richard Ewell had served in the wilderness, Spotsylvania, then comes down with an illness, leaves the Army, and Lee takes that opportunity to push him off into Richmond. So when Richmond falls, Ewell's at a desk job, so he's going to pull together, as you pointed out, the heavy artillerists, who ironically we have Confederates who are sometimes 4-year veterans who've never fired a shot in anger before, so we have some green troops here in the waning days of the Civil War. We have Marines, we have the the CS Navy, excuse me. Nepotism's alive and well in the Confederate Army, so there's Custis Lee here, out here commanding troops, and then Joseph Kershaw's veteran First Corps troops, because when the fall of Petersburg and Richmond takes place, Longstreet's command is very much broken up. So we have George Pickett's division, who's fighting with Richard Anderson's corps. We have Joe Kershaw up here with Richard Ewell, and then we have the rest of the Third Corps and First Corps with James Longstreet marching off the battlefield. So here we are. It's April 6th. We have about 72 hours before Appomattox happens. Of course, they don't know that. Let's set the stage of what we would be looking at if we're a Confederate looking across this valley out towards that Union 6th Corps. And we'll talk about those Union guys here in a moment.
So what sets the scene here is the attack that takes place about 1.5 miles from here behind me at Holt's Corner. Phil Sheridan and his Federal cavalry start launching a series of hit-and-run tactics, and they slam into the column forcing Richard Anderson and Richard Ewell down to this position. So as they come down the hill, they use the Hillsman House as a field hospital, come across the creek, redeploy, and to understand this section of the battlefield, I think you have to look at them offensively before you look at them defensively. When Fitzhugh Lee leaves the field, he notices and comments that General Ewell's men are faced in opposite directions. That's because Federal cavalry swings around after the attack at Holt's Corner and comes up in the next intersection at the Harper Farm, and they cut the road. So these men initially deploy to push through that Federal cavalry when the 6th Corps makes their attack from behind the Hillsman Farm.
Because basically what's happening on the Union side is Phil Sheridan smells blood in the water. Now Sheridan's in charge of the Army of the Shenandoah. He basically has the horsemen, most of the horsemen of this campaign under him. There's some others not under his command like George Crook. So he's going to coordinate with one of his hard hitters, Tom Devon and George Custer, to sort of keep the Confederates in place while he goes and gets the 6th Corps. 6th Corps is part of the Army of the Potomac, but it served with him in the Army of the Shenandoah during the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864. So this is crucial. We're seeing that Sheridan knows how to work with his men under him. He knows how to work with Horatio Wright's 6th Corps. So his orders are basically drive them. We're going to hold them in place while I swing in with this 6th Corps who are marching hard here and try to envelop these troops. Meantime, and Josh can jump in here, we have the Confederates who are trying to get away. They have supply wagons. They left with more than 250 pieces of artillery from Richmond. They keep losing those along the way. The horses, the mules are breaking down, so the supply wagons are breaking down. And Josh also pointed out the fact there were civilians. Remember, the civilians of Richmond and Petersburg also are on these roads, clogging these roads, and it's sometimes blocking the army and having to get them out of the way here. So with Richard Ewell, again, first Field Command since May of 1864, he's put together this hodgepodge where we have Sheridan, who knows how to work with Custer, Merritt, Devon, over and Wright. On this side, we have Ewell, who's dealing with Joe Kershaw, who's a veteran commander, but you have Custis Lee, you have Tucker, who's in command of the naval forces, which sounds silly out here, but it's true. And then, of course, you have the heavy artillerists and others out here. So this is the Kobayashi Maru for you Star Trek fans. This is the no-win situation, I think, for poor Richard Ewell. So let's play this out in real time, because Sailor's Creek, remember, 3 distinct actions all kind of coming together. So what's happening in this action now on April 6th?
The action here is it's chaotic, as we've been talking about. It's almost hard to explain, and especially with a map that has red and blue lines that don't move. Insert map here for Sailor's Creek. There are instances where regiments and commands are refusing the flank. Some Confederates are set up along the road here facing the Hillsman House. It's hard to show that on a map when they charge up the hill after refusing the flank by the bayonets. It's an absolute chaotic mess here for these men.
And let's talk about how lopsided this is. In one respect, we have heavy artillerists who are on here for the Confederates, who don't have an artillery with them. On the other side, we have the 6th Corps with Andrew Cowan, who's bringing up his guns to fire on us. He takes 2 casualties in this entire battle because there's no one counter battery fire. You pointed out that some of these guys have flintlocks, whereas you flip to the Union side and the 37th Massachusetts are carrying Spencer repeating rifles. So this is not what we would call a fair fight, if you would ask that. But the Confederates do hold their own for a while.
They do. They do. The Federals end up sweeping through the line of works that are right here behind the remnants of them are behind the split rail fence down in the field, and the Federals then essentially turn the flank as they come in. The Federal cavalry come in from Holt's Corner, pin these gentlemen in, and then the attack goes down the hill, and it breaks out into a melee, which, as we know, hand-to-hand combat was not that common, but it did happen here, and it was pretty brutal along the banks of the creek.
Yeah, the second Rhode Island, made famous by Elijah Hunt Rhodes, I think they talk about being surprised that they get hit by the Confederates and then break. That this is a veteran unit being hit by, in some ways, green Confederates, and they break. I think getting into the hand-to-hand combat, the story that I always like to tell is Samuel Eddy from the Company D of the 37th Massachusetts. Eddy is a 42-year-old veteran at this point, the 37th a veteran unit, and the adjutant of his regiment thinks that a Confederate colonel is coming over to surrender to him. And as this colonel comes over to him, he actually draws his pistol and fires on the adjutant and wounds him twice. And Eddy jumps from the ranks, shoots that man, and at about that same time, a Confederate bayonets him through the back, through the body, and kind of pins him to the ground. Eddy's able to get another cartridge into his Spencer, kill that man who falls on top of him, gets up, pulls the bayonet out from him, and walks to the rear. And for his actions, he's a Medal of Honor recipient. I mean, that shows the brutality of the battle out here.
He absolutely is, and this whole action is absolutely filled with those stories. That is one of my favorite ones that you just shared there about Sam.
Sorry if I stole it.
No, you're fine. I was going to point out that there are 64 Medal of Honor recipients dated April the 6th, 1865, and 54 of those 64 for captured flags. Tom Custer attacks with his command at the Harper Farm and is able to capture his 2nd flag of the campaign, and he becomes the first dual recipient of the Medal of Honor.
Yeah, and I think there are 19 dual recipients. I might be incorrect. I'm doing that off the top of my head. And Tom's the first one. And what's interesting afterwards, George Custer in his marching column always had a place of honor for somebody who captured a flag. And when they march off the battlefield here at Sailor's Creek, riding right behind him were all of these men who had captured flag after flag within his command here. This is the largest, basically, surrender of Lee's army since Spotsylvania Courthouse nearly 1 year earlier, whenever Johnston's division's overrun at the Bloody Angle. And before we get into the numbers of how many Confederates are killed, wounded, captured, the Union as well, let's tie up what other fighting we had here. We had the Lockett Farm, the fighting, dual bridges, they call it. We also had the crossroads south of us. So why don't we start down there, talk about Richard Heron Anderson and his fight, George Pickett, Bushrod Johnson taking on Custer, and then we'll move our way up the line.
All right. So as Richard Anderson and his men cross Sailor's Creek and come up in this direction, again, I think you have to look at them offensively. They are trying to push through approximately 7,000 to 8,000 mounted and dismounted Federal cavalrymen that are on this ridge, posing a serious threat. And when they come up into this area, they deploy, they start to dig in, anticipating waiting on the rest of the army to kind of concentrate and come up behind them. When Federals don't wait for the attack, or don't wait for them to attack, they commence attacking them, mounted and dismounted, at Marshall's Crossroads.
And the Federals have some problems dealing with the topography here and Mother Nature and the terrain. Can we talk about that for a moment? Because I know some of the mounted troopers are trying to ride forward and then they ride into some swamps and some boggy land. What's the weather like that day? I mean, today it's chilly out here, you could probably tell. But what was it like at the time of the battle?
So based on the accounts we have, we believe the temperature is in the 40s, but it is dropping down really colder than that, around the 20s in the evening. There are some reports of snow that happened later that evening and into the next day. So these men are cold. It had rained a few days before the fighting here, so everything's muddy, which really makes transportation a difficult thing. And these roads were an absolute quagmire as the troops came through here.
And as we move into the next phase, I'm glad you set that up almost perfectly, but this is completely unplanned. As Ewell's corps or column comes through here, he's actually going to start turning part of his wagon train out of the way. And at some points, the wagoneers abandon their wagons. Right. The horses are so fatigued they can't move, and that will draw John Brown Gordon and the Confederate Second Army Corps off into another direction, into another battle, the 3 battles of Sailor's Creek. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Yes, the 6th Corps, Army of Potomac, had a little bit to do with that turn of the wagons there at what we call Holt's Corner. They essentially did the same thing they did up here and slammed into the flank, forcing some of the command to come down here. And it's not an even split with the Army, but the lead elements in the vanguard take a right earlier in the day, and they've headed down towards Double Bridges and the Lockett Farm to get into Rice and then eventually move into Farmville. But it's that attack at Holt's Corner that leads to essentially what takes place where we're at right now.
And Lee and Longstreet are heading off in that direction, correct? So Lee and Longstreet don't know what's actually happening in the rear of the column. I think this goes back to the miscommunication. Love him or hate him, Phil Sheridan is communicating with the guys under his command. Grant's communicating well. We have a very coherent order of battle and chain of command for the Federals. On the Confederate side, we have George Pickett now serving under Richard Anderson. We have Kershaw up here and all those commands we talked about earlier. So I think there's a massive breakdown in communications with the Confederates because at times they don't know who they're actually responding to who. And I know that there's confusion in this area as well. Robert Stiles, who leaves us a fantastic memoir, talks about fighting up here, and he told one of his men not to wear a captured Union uniform because basically whenever they're getting out of here, as Josh pointed out, it's cold, it's raining, they're trying to put on anything he can. And at one point the fighting became so confused up here that Stiles watched one of his men walk up to one of his comrades and put his gun right to the back of his head, thinking that he's a Yankee because he's dressed in blue. And Stiles tried to knock away that gun with his sword, and he's unable to do so, and the own man shot, basically blew the brains out of another Confederate. So the confusion up here is reigning. There's a lack of communication, roads, quagmires, everything like that. It's all breaking down. And Lee, remember, is still trying to escape. He's trying to get those rations, trying to get to the west, and then eventually make that big turn south to get down into the Carolinas to meet up with Joe Johnston in that forlorn hope that is looking more and more bleak. So Josh, let's talk about the outcomes here of Sailor's Creek. The ultimate outcome is we have 72 hours until Appomattox. Of course, the men at the time don't know that. But what is the blow to Robert E. Lee's army? What's left of Lee's army? Let's talk about, first off, the casualties. Then let's talk about the laundry list of officers who were captured here.
Sure. Yeah, the casualties are absolutely incredible. The Army of Northern Virginia has dealt a heavy death knell blow here, and they're just not able to recuperate. It's not the last battle that they fight. As we know, they end up fighting through Farmville, across High Bridge. There's a fight at Cumberland Church. There's 2 battles that take place at Appomattox, one on the evening of the 8th, one on the morning of the 9th. But the casualties that mount here are mostly men that are captured, mostly men that are prisoners of war and are sent to prison camp. These men are not encompassed by the terms of men that are paroled at Appomattox Courthouse. Not to spoil the end there, of course, but these men do go off to federal prison. Some numbers, conservative numbers, I think, are around 7,700. Those numbers are probably a little bit higher. Okay. But we're looking at several thousand casualties on both sides and several hundred killed on both sides, but we don't have a distinct number like some places do.
And of course we have officers being captured down through here. So Joseph Kershaw captured. Right. Richard Ewell had an interesting story of trying to surrender to the Federals. Can you tell that story?
Yes, he is sent to, I believe it's Horatio Wright's headquarters after being captured here, and almost immediately tries to say, I didn't do it. And they were questioning him kind of what he meant by saying that. And it eventually got out that he was concerned that the Federals were going to punish him, potentially hang him for setting the fires and burning Richmond that ended up, as we know, getting out of control, and a lot of the city burnt. But Ewell was ordered to do that, and he wanted to almost immediately try to clear his name with his now captors to save his own life, as it were.
Yeah, and they talk about him. First, he's going to try to surrender to an officer of his equal. He's a lieutenant general. There's no lieutenant generals here except for Ulysses S. Grant on the Union side. Then he comes across a lone sergeant and then surrenders to a sergeant. Almost got shot by somebody as he comes in. And allegedly his last order to his men was something along the lines of, "I would like some tomatoes." I'm not making that up. That was he's a quirky guy. He's a very quirky guy, and that's allegedly like one of his last orders was, "I would like tomatoes." But we have also, Custis Lee. Lee's son is captured here, and one of my favorite stories coming out of Sailor's Creek revolves around George Custer. On the evening in the aftermath of the evening, he invites Joseph Kershaw, Custis Lee, and others down to stay in his tent and stay in his camp. And Joseph Kershaw said something along the lines of, "This was the most chivalric officer I have met in the war," because it's almost like the camaraderie that we'll start to see as we go into Appomattox of this old army coming together, even though Joe Kershaw wasn't in the old army, of these guys coming back together and the getting to know one another again and swapping war stories. And I thought that was fascinating. Here's George Custer, now victorious, now is inviting everyone down.
Shared a blanket with them, shared brandy with them.
Yeah.
Had bands play Dixie as they marched by. It's incredible.
And then, of course, and if you want to tell the story, feel free. My favorite story coming from the aftermath too, or one of my favorite stories, is the fact that they capture all this Confederate money. And then the Union start to hand out all this money to the Confederates, paying the Confederates almost as an insult. And then they're starting to bet that night with like outrageous amounts of Confederate currency. Anything you want to say about that?
The contents on the wagon alone are absolutely fascinating. I mean, you have to think they're trying to reestablish the Confederate government elsewhere.
Yeah.
And everything that's in these trains are for that purpose. So there are, massive armoires full of clothing. There are officers' uniforms and baggage, paperwork from the Confederate government, millions of dollars worth of currency that Kris just mentioned, cast iron cookware, porcelain, china, silverware, you name it, and a litter of puppies, of all things, in one of the wagons, along with wounded and provisions for the horses and mules and the men. So, it's no wonder that in a lot of these cases you see the bridges collapse as they're coming through the area. But yeah, the contents are just absolutely fascinating.
And before I turn it back over to Garry here, I just also want to mention, George Pickett, Bushrod Johnson, Richard Anderson. These are guys who will lose their commands because there's no commands left. Many of their men are captured. Some will desert. But there's a story, especially coming from Robert E. Lee's camp, of Lee trying to rally some of the troops when he finds out what's going on here, and sees some of his officers, including George Pickett, not really standing to their post and just kind of slinking to the rear. And then in the aftermath, he's going to start relieving officers like George Pickett. And there comes the story of George Pickett at Appomattox, where allegedly he's there, and Lee allegedly says, "Is that man still with this army?" And I think that goes back to a lot of people like to put it on Pickett's charge. I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it has to do with Five Forks when that fell, and then of course what happens here at Sailor's Creek. I think he was very upset with what happened with some of his officers, whereas others like Ewell, Kershaw, and others are standing here. Right. And finally, let's just talk about the last one. Let's talk about the Naval Battalion very quickly. I heard that Commodore Tucker, even though he's probably a captain, would say, "Throw back the boarding party" whenever he was ordering when the Yankees came up over top of the hill. Is that true? Is there any truth to that?
I haven't heard that particular one, but it would not surprise me. One of my favorite anecdotes from this action is the Federals, as they were capturing some of the CS Navy. They're wearing their jumpers, right? So they're full decked out in their regalia and have their land boarding swords and everything, cutlasses.
Yeah.
And
it's like an Errol Flynn movie,
right? One of the Federals kind of throws a jeer at the Confederates right after they're captured and says, "I didn't know you Rebs had gunboats way up here," which is ironic for Sailor's Creek, which is spelled the nautical sailor. And of course there was some interaction passed back and forth.
You know, I
with that.
also heard that Tucker was giving orders when they were marching to, instead of bifiles right or left, it was starboard or
Right.
port and everything. So
Right. A lot of ayes. And
yes, yes, they said aye instead of yes, sir. So it was great. Josh, I'm going to let you tell us a little bit about Sailor's Creek while I swap out here with Garry. Why don't you tell us about Sailor's Creek, what the visitors can expect out here, and are you open year round, and what kind of programs that you're offering?
Sure. Yeah, we are open year-round. We are only closed 2 days out of the year. Sailor's Creek is an absolute wonderful battlefield. It's not like most battlefields, a place like Gettysburg or Antietam, where you go and you can see where each individual flank was in some cases, where the markers were, with the exception of a few interpretive markers on our trails that help us tell the story. There's not a lot here. And in fact, one of the greatest questions I got asked years ago was by a visitor, and I showed her an American Battlefield Trust map, and she asked me, she said, you know, how do y'all know that the troops were ever in this moment and in this spot? And I thought that was a fantastic question. I told her, well, we don't. I said, you know, especially here in this fight, it's a running fight. The troops are here and then they're not almost as quickly as they came here. So if they were ever in that moment in time from, you know, a snapshot from 30,000 feet, the truth is they were gone so quickly. But today, like I said, we are a Virginia State battlefield. We have hiking trails. We do have a 10-mile driving loop that goes to several places with wayside exhibits with the help of Civil War Trails and the American Battlefield Trust. So when you come here, we look forward to seeing you.
Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you, everybody, because 1,300 plus of the acres preserved here were preserved with your help. So thanks so much. I have one last question for you,
Yes, sir.
and then I'll wrap things up. Okay, you said it was spelled like the nautical sailor, but I've seen other spellings. Summarize this for us. Make it really plain to people. How do you spell Sailor's Creek?
The answer is yes. I don't know that there is a right or a wrong answer. The reason that we spell it the way we do, the S-A-I-L-O-R, like the nautical sailor, is that is the earliest that we have seen it surface on a map. That dates to 1749. A man by the name of Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's father, was also a cartographer. And when he mapped this area, which was then frontier, it shows up S-A-I-L-O-R. Not sure why, not sure if there's a right or wrong. But if and when you come to the park, you'll notice that the road you come in on is spelled differently. So there's at least 5 different spellings that I've seen, and I've seen other people try to come up with a few others.
Classic.
That's
Okay.
interesting.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. To everybody, we hope you've been following us since we've left Petersburg and come out towards Sailor's Creek. Expect some videos on High Bridge, Appomattox Station, Appomattox Courthouse, maybe a little Cumberland Church, and some other special surprises along the way. Thanks, Josh, so much, and thanks to Kris White behind the camera. Thank you all for watching and for supporting battlefield education and preservation.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.